Have you ever been in a conversation with someone and somewhere along the way you just stopped listening? Maybe they disagreed with you or they questioned something you said. Maybe they challenged an opinion you felt pretty confident about. And while they were explaining themselves, you just stopped listening. Instead, you started building your response. You're thinking, yeah, but they don't understand. They don't have my experience. Or maybe you're thinking, if they would just let me explain this one more time. I know that feeling really well because when I believe I'm right, listening becomes incredibly difficult. And sometimes the problem isn't even that the other person disagrees with me. Sometimes what bothers me the most is that I don't feel heard or respected or even recognized for what I do know. Lately, I've started wondering though, when does confidence in what we know quietly turn into pride? Welcome back to From Hollow to Holy. I'm your host, Justin, and this is Shadows, a series where we explore the subtle tactics, distractions, and patterns that quietly pull us away from the peace, purpose, and ultimately from Christ. Last week, we talked about shame and how failure, weakness, and difficult experiences can slowly become something we believe about our identity. This week, we're going to talk about something different. Something I think that is incredibly easy to see in other people, while at the same time incredibly uncomfortable to recognize within ourselves. That's pride. Now, I'm not talking about walking around and thinking you're better than everybody else type of pride. I'm talking about a quieter kind. The kind that says, I already know that. I've got enough experience. They don't understand this topic like I do. Or maybe simply, if I know I'm right, why should I even have to listen? Because I'm beginning to realize that pride doesn't always show up in my life as arrogance. Sometimes it shows up as defensiveness. Other times it shows up as anger or just needing credit. And sometimes it simply shows up when being right starts mattering more to me than being teachable. And after a conversation with my son recently, it showed me just how quickly this can happen. A few days ago, my oldest son was putting together a resume. He's old enough now that he wants to start applying for jobs. And he asked me to look over his resume. Now, I've built resumes before. I've studied this kind of thing as part of my own education. I've applied for jobs, I've interviewed, I've looked through applications. So when he hands me this resume, dad just goes to work. I start giving him feedback. Things like change this or move this here. This needs to be worded differently. Maybe take this out. Just the dad stuff that I can do. And then he looks at me and he says something along the lines of, well, dad, that's not what AI told me to do. And immediately I could feel it. The first thought in my head was basically, why did you even bother asking me? I was annoyed because, from my perspective, I'm thinking, you asked me to look at this. You asked me for advice and I gave you advice. And now you're going to question everything I just said because your AI told you something different? And I think underneath that frustration, there was even a little more. It almost felt like he didn't trust me. It felt like what he was saying was, Dad, what would you know about this? Look, I know that's not what he said. And looking back, I don't think that's even what he meant. I mean, he's a teenager and he's comparing two sources of information, and that's pretty normal. But that's not what my pride heard. What my pride heard was, your experience doesn't matter. And I wanted to respond to that. Oh man, I wanted to respond. But thankfully, I've learned something about myself over the years. Speaking before thinking has almost never ended well for me. We've actually talked about that on this podcast before. So I held my tongue for a moment. And what eventually came out was basically, okay, you do you, bud. My wife was sitting there and pointed out that I actually had quite a bit of experience creating resumes since I went to school for it also. My son looked at us and just gave us that traditional teenage, okay, and then walked away. Conversation over. But thinking about it, my conversation with myself wasn't, because I kept thinking about why it bothered me so much. And the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable the answer became. Part of me genuinely wanted to help my son, but part of me also wanted him to recognize that dad knows something. I wanted my experience acknowledged. I wanted my advice valued. And apparently, I wanted to be right. See, there's a little rush that comes from being proven right. I know everybody feels it, especially if someone questioned you first. They disagree with you, you defend your position, time passes, and then bam, turns out you were right. And suddenly your head gets like 3 sizes bigger. For me, I start thinking, see, I knew it. And if I'm not careful, that one correct opinion suddenly makes me pretty confident that the other 17 opinions I've made must also be correct. And that's where I've gotten myself into trouble because being right can become intoxicating. And strangely enough, it doesn't usually make me more charitable. Oftentimes, it makes me less willing to listen the next time around. And I've had plenty of conversations throughout my marriage where I was asked what I thought and I gave my opinion, and then felt myself becoming defensive when that opinion was questioned. There were times years ago when, if things eventually unfolded the way I predicted, yet I wasn't listened to, I wanted that satisfaction of saying, see, I told you I was right. And sometimes I did. Now, I've stopped doing that nearly as much, but if I'm being honest, that desire hasn't completely disappeared. Sometimes now, what I do is I just shake my head and I walk away, which really is an improvement, but I'm not entirely sure silently thinking I told you so makes me spiritually mature here. It just makes me quieter. And that realization has made me look at something else. See, for years I described myself as having a temper. And I'll face it, I do. But as I've reflected on some of those arguments I had over the years, I'm starting to wonder how many times what I called my temper was actually just pride demanding to be heard. This has been especially important in my family. My wife and I are raising a blended family, and there are times where we disagree about how to handle something with one of our kids. My instinct at times has been, I've been a parent longer. I know what I'm doing. And once that thought takes over, guess what happens? Well, I stop listening because I've already decided who the expert is, and that's me. But over time, I've learned something. My wife sees things that I don't. She approaches situations from that different angle. And really, her perspective at times works extraordinarily well and often better for what we're trying to accomplish together. Now, that doesn't erase my experience, it just simply adds another perspective to it. I've had to learn something similar with my children. Even when I've experienced something that looks similar to what one of them is going through, I have to think their experience is still their own. Their mind isn't my mind. Their fears are not my fears, and their circumstances aren't mine. Their story is their own. See, experience can give us wisdom, but experience can also convince us that our perspective is the only perspective worth trusting. And those are two very different things. I think back about younger Justin, and I think he would have had a much harder time understanding that. He would have gotten angry, raised his voice, walked away, came back, raised his voice again and pushed harder, explained it again and again and again. Because surely, if younger Justin could just explain that position one more time, maybe with slightly louder or more volume, everyone would finally understand how correct he was. Turns out, volume is not one of the gifts of the Spirit. Who knew? There's a story in the Old Testament that's been sitting differently with me as I've thought about this. It's the story of Naaman in 2 Kings chapter 5. See, Naaman was a captain of the Syrian army. He was respected and powerful. The scriptures even describe him as being a mighty man of valor. But he also had leprosy. Eventually, he hears that there's a prophet in Israel who might be able to help him. So Naaman travels to see Elisha, and I imagine Naaman had an idea about how this was all supposed to happen. He gets there, and maybe the prophet would come out, call upon God, perform some dramatic miracle, make a huge scene, something worthy of an important military commander like Naaman. Instead, Elisha sends a messenger, and the instructions are basically Go wash in the Jordan River 7 times. That's it. And Naaman gets angry. The scriptures even say, but Naaman was wroth and went away. See, he had expected Elisha to come out personally. He had expected the healing to happen differently. He even argues that the rivers back home are better than the waters of Israel. Naaman had reasons, and that's the part I can relate to. He didn't just say no, he had a case, he had logic, he had expectations. He could explain exactly why the instructions didn't make sense to him. And then something remarkable happens. His servants approach him. Think about that. Naaman is the commander, he's the powerful one. And people beneath his social position are the ones that challenge him. They essentially ask him, if the prophet had asked you to do some great thing, wouldn't you have done it? So why not do the simple thing that he's actually asking you to do? And Naaman listens. He goes down into the Jordan, he washes 7 times, and he's healed. Now, we usually focus on the healing, but I think another miracle happened before Naaman ever even touched the water. For a moment, Naaman allowed himself to consider that he might be wrong. Boy, that sentence is uncomfortable, huh? What if I'm wrong? Now, I'm not saying I am wrong. What I am saying is, what if I'm wrong? See, humility doesn't require us to immediately surrender every opinion whenever someone disagrees. It doesn't mean expertise doesn't matter or that an opinion is equally correct. It simply means we leave enough room in our certainty to say, maybe there is something here I haven't considered. In Proverbs chapter 12, verse 15, it says, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearketh unto counsel is wise. That verse hits differently once you've spent years being really good at explaining why you're right. Wisdom isn't described there as knowing everything. It's connected to the willingness to listen. And listening is hard when we're busy defending ourselves. But there's another side of pride that I've been wrestling with recently. Sometimes I don't want to just be right. I want credit for being right. Recently, I had an idea at work. I shared it. And later, I watched that idea get picked up and applied elsewhere. It was a great idea, something useful that came from it. And I didn't get any credit for it. That bothered me. Actually, to be honest, sometimes it still bothers me. There's this little part of me that wants to say, hey man, that was my idea. And I've had to sit with this uncomfortable question. And that question is, if the idea was good and the idea helped somebody, why does everyone need to know it came from me? Now, I think giving people appropriate credit does matter. And I'm not suggesting that recognition is somehow evil, but I am examining my own heart here. What did I actually want? Did I want the good result or just the recognition for creating the result? And if the answer is both, which one matters more to me? Now, I don't completely love my answer yet, and that's something I'm still working on. I think about President Dieter F. Uchtdorf and his general conference message in 2014 that's titled, Lord, is it I? In that conference talk, he talked about our tendency to recognize problems in other people is much easier than when we recognize them in ourselves. And he points towards a better question. Lord, is it I? I think that's exactly the type of question that pride hates. See, pride wants, Lord, do you see what they're doing? While humility will ask, Lord, what am I doing? Pride will ask, why won't they listen to me? And humility will ask, have I actually listened to them? Pride says, I deserve credit. While humility will ask, if something good happened, can I still be grateful even though nobody knows that I helped? Those questions aren't comfortable, and maybe they're just not supposed to be. Recently, I've wondered whether some of the frustration I experience in my personal life and at work is just teaching me something. I don't know that God is intentionally causing people to question me. I don't think I can make that claim. But I do believe that God can teach me through what happens. And maybe the frustration of not feeling heard can teach me how to listen. Maybe being questioned can teach me how to examine why I need agreement so badly. Maybe being overlooked can teach me why recognition matters to me. Maybe discouragement itself can actually be a classroom. That's a very uncomfortable classroom, isn't it? I've even started to believe that discomfort isn't necessarily evidence that something's gone wrong. Sometimes discomfort is where growth begins. Think about it. Naaman nearly walked away from his miracle because the answer didn't look the way that he expected. That makes me wonder how many times I've walked away from something that God could have taught me because the person delivering the message wasn't someone I expected to learn from. Whether that be a spouse or a child, a coworker or a student, maybe it was someone with less experience than me, or someone who just simply couldn't communicate very well. If I'm only teachable, would I've already respect the source? I'm not sure that's really teachability. So this week, I want to try something, and maybe you can try it with me. The next time someone challenges something you're certain about, notice what happens inside you. Before you defend yourself, before you explain, or before you start gathering evidence, pause. And let's ask, what might they be seeing that I can't? You may still disagree, and you may listen carefully and discover your original position was right. That's totally okay. The goal isn't to become uncertain about everything. The goal is just to become humble enough that being challenged doesn't automatically feel like being attacked. Because being right and responding right are not always the same thing. And being wrong isn't failure. Sometimes being willing to just discover that we're wrong is exactly how God teaches us something we couldn't learn while we were defending ourselves. If this episode made you think of someone, don't send it to them because they need to work on their pride. That's probably missing the point. Maybe sit with it yourself first. I know I need to. And if you eventually know someone who would genuinely benefit from walking through this conversation with us, then share it. We're all learning. We're all getting some things wrong in life. Thankfully, Jesus Christ doesn't require us to already know everything before he can teach us. He just simply asks us to keep following. Thank you for walking with me today. This is From Hollow to Holy. Until next time, hold your convictions firmly enough to live them and humbly enough to examine them. Remember, progress over perfection.